What's up makers, Mike Clifford here, and this time I'm going to show you how I created this epoxy resin and plywood pixelated river bench for the Rockler Plywood Challenge put on by the Modern Maker podcast. The only restriction on the challenge was that you had to limit yourself to one sheet of plywood, and I used a 1/2 inch plywood sheet and cut down a bunch of 1-inch strips, which I'll use to form the base layer of the bench. Before going further, I want to take a few seconds to talk about the design of the pixelated river for this bench. Normally I wing it with design, but this time I opened up SketchUp and started coming up with a few different options to kind of go against the river table trend that's out there now, and it seems really overplayed. And I put these designs on Instagram, and it was a group process to come up with this final pixelated river design. There's going to be 2 layers of the bench. So this bottom layer, you're going to have these exposed plies. We're going to put the epoxy running down the middle of it, and I think that it'll be a really cool effect to have the river bed be the exposed plies you can see through the epoxy. Let's get going and glue this up. One thing I want to clarify is why I'm only making 1 plywood sheet here. I'm actually going to cut the top of the bench and both legs from the same sheet, which is going to make some things easier later on. After waiting for the glue to dry overnight, I took the stacked plywood sheet over to my planer and ran it through to get it perfectly flat. Now, you could do this with a belt sander, but if you do it with a planer, be sure to take off a very little bit at a time because the glue on the plywood can be really harsh on your planer's blades otherwise. So we've got the bottom layer plain flat here, and now we're going to make the top layer of the plywood bench. The top layer is actually going to be formed from 1/2 strips of plywood that are flipped the opposite way, so you see the top, and 2 longer, thicker strips on the side. Now these little strips are going to be different lengths to kind of create some fingers, or it'll create the effect of flowing or dripping water over the edge with the epoxy that we're going to put in the middle here around this plywood, and you'll see the layers of the plywood showing through that epoxy, which I think will give a cool effect. Now I designed the pixelated river shape that I liked in SketchUp, and so to get that shape into the actual bench, I just took some screenshots of the SketchUp model and brought those down with me so I could cut the pieces of plywood to the right lengths. As I marked the cut line on each strip, I also wrote down a number so I could remember where to put it when I did the full glue up, and then took the strips over to the miter saw to cut them down to length. Off camera, I cut 2 wider strips of plywood that would form the sides of the river, then test fit everything for the top layer to make sure it fit, and then went to glue it up. While I'm gluing that up, I want to take a quick minute, remind you, if you like my videos and my builds, click the like button, click the subscribe button, and hit the bell button to make sure you get notified about future builds. After gluing in all the strips, I used some scrap melamine to create cauls, which create a downward pressure and prevent the sideways pressure of the glue up from popping the strips up and out of the river. After letting that glue dry, it was time for the big epoxy pour. So I used aluminum tape on the underside of the plywood to prevent any epoxy that might seep through the plywood from getting out and dripping all over the place. For the epoxy, I used a 2-part marine tabletop epoxy that I got off of Amazon. I'll put a link below. Now, I did have some issues with this, but it was all due to user error, as I'll explain momentarily, and I think this actually is a pretty good epoxy alternative to the really expensive stuff, and it's probably like a third or even a quarter of the price. For pigments, I used a blue and teal pigment. I mixed them separately and then mixed them together in the riverbed to get a kind of cool ocean look to the table. Now with this epoxy, you can't pour it super thick, so I did a thin layer first as a kind of seal coat to prevent the epoxy from seeping through. And I then went back after it had dried a couple hours and poured in the rest of the epoxy in 3 more stages. Immediately after pouring each layer, I applied heat to it with a heat gun, and this removes the bubbles so it dries crystal clear. So the epoxy's been curing for 24 hours and we've got a hiccup here. It didn't cure all the way. Actually, just the top 1/8 didn't cure. The bottom is hard, but got this gooey mess here on top. So what I'm gonna do is just take this scraper and scrape the top 1/8 inch out of here, try to get it good and clean, mix some new epoxy, make sure we get it exactly 1:1, and pour it in, and then hopefully we'll be back on track. The next day, I was excited to come back and find that the epoxy had cured. It was hard, and I got the belt sander out to start sanding it down level with the plywood top. However, that excitement was short-lived because as I was sanding, there was a problem. So you might be wondering why I'm standing in front of another glue up of strips of plywood right now. I already did that, but here's the deal. I had a second problem with the epoxy. So after I re-poured the top layer, it cured and I started sanding it down and it was going okay, but then I got a little peel up and then a little bit more, and next thing you know, the whole top layer that I put down was basically peeling off of the previous cured layer. So what happened, I think, is that when I scraped off the epoxy top layer that didn't cure, it left a sticky film, and somehow that sticky film on the cured layer of epoxy prevented the new layer of epoxy from bonding to it. I had to use mineral spirits to go in. Basically, it was like using Goo Gone to remove all the sticky stuff from the top layer of epoxy. I re-poured it, and I hope, cross my fingers, that that's gonna work. But while I was waiting 2 days to be sure for that top layer to cure, I wanted to make sure I made the deadline for the Plywood Challenge, and that's why I've got this second glue up here. But I'm hoping I don't have to use it, so let's get going now and try to sand down that layer of epoxy that I just poured for the 3rd time, and hopefully 3rd time's a charm. All right, guys, I'm really excited. We managed to save this bench on the 3rd try. The epoxy worked. The top layer adhered to the rest of it. It cured, it's solid. I got to sand it down with the belt sander. It's fine. So now we can get to cutting this long piece up into the 3 pieces that will form the bench. I marked the lines where I would cut both of the legs from the single sheet, leaving the bench top in the middle remaining. I first made straight cuts to cut each leg to length. I then went back and angled the blade at 7.5 degrees so that each leg would have a mitered corner that splayed out at 15 degrees. And lastly, I made an angled cut at 15 degrees at the bottom of each leg so that the legs would sit flush with the floor. I then went to do the glue up for the mitered joints, and I made a jig here that I thought would make it easier to clamp these corners that were angled out at 15 degrees. So they were actually 105-degree angles. However, the jigs just didn't work very well. I think Sean Boyd just released a video on how to clamp up miters. Go watch that. It'll probably work way better than this did. I wouldn't really recommend this method for clamping up miters, but I was able to hack through it and get it done. One thing to note here is that when you're gluing up the epoxy leg, you really wanted to be careful not to get the glue on the epoxy, because you would see it through the epoxy when you're done, and you didn't want that. So I knew the glue wasn't strong enough on its own, and I was thinking I might need a stretcher, but I wanted to try and avoid it. So what I did is I just used a technique to add approximately 4 to 5 inch long half-inch dowels in through each miter. And what I did was just start with a very small bit and work my way up to a half-inch Forstner bit to pre-drill the hole as deep as I could go. I added some glue in each hole and then used a mallet to drive the dowels in as far as they would go. I then used a Japanese flush cut saw to trim those off. And I repeated that process to give 2 dowels on the river flowing side and 3 dowels on the other side. And I was actually pretty excited. It was solid when I sat on it, so I just moved on to polishing the epoxy. Now this was the first time I had ever really tried to polish an epoxy, and it took a little figuring out, but actually it was pretty easy. So I just sanded it with wet hand sandpaper up to 2000 grit, which left it pretty shiny. And then I got this Novus plastic polish 3-part kit that works to really give it a mirror shine. Now I only used part 2 and part 1, and part 2 you just apply with a buffing rag. I got one that works on my drill here, and then the part 3 is just a spray on that you wipe in, and honestly I'm not sure if it's much different than Windex, but it did give it a pretty awesome shine. Now because the belt sander leveling the epoxy had ripped up the plywood pretty well, I knew I couldn't just leave it a natural wood surface, so I was going to paint the rest of it white, and had to use painter's tape to cover the epoxy, and it was quite an arts and crafts project to get this done, but got it done, and then got out some joint compound to try and fill in the gaps. And I picked this tip up from Glenn over at DIY Creators, and it worked pretty well. It was a little easier than wood filler for a large application like this and leveling off gaps that had been left by the belt sander. One disadvantage of joint compound is the amount of dust it makes. So I took it out on my roof to sand it down that night, because it was a great summertime night in Chicago. I then used my favorite Montana Gold spray paint to give it a nice white finish. Went back off camera, peeled the tape off to reveal the finished bench, and I'm kind of enamored how this came out. I hope you guys like it too. Leave a comment, let me know what you think. If you like this, as always, click the subscribe button, hit the bell button next to it to make sure you get notified about future builds. That's it for this time, and I'll see you next time.